The wind came first, then the dust, then her. Stephen James saw the shape of her before he understood what he was looking at. A woman on her knees in the white heat of the Dakota afternoon, both hands wrapped around a wagon pole twice her size, dragging it 1 inch at a time across cracked earth that hadn't seen rain in 3 weeks. Her dress was the color of the dirt she knelt in. Her belly was round and heavy beneath it, and still she pulled. He had a rule, 3 years old, forged in the ash of a barn fire that took his son from him before the boy had lived past 6 summers. The rule was simple. Nobody gets close enough to be lost again. He broke it before he even climbed down from the saddle. Greetings, gentle viewers. I trust this day finds you in good health and high spirits. Hello, and thank you for being here. Before we continue, if this story has already found a place in your heart, take a moment to subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone who still believes in a good old-fashioned love story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read every one, and we would love to say hello back. We're working toward a milestone of 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you brings us closer. Thank you for being part of this. Now, let's return to the Badlands. The Dakota Territory in the summer of 1881 did not forgive weakness. The creeks had gone to cracked mud by the middle of July. Cattle bunched together under the thin shade of scrub pine, too tired to graze. Men who had lived on this land their whole lives still spoke of the heat the way sailors speak of a storm, carefully and with respect. Stephen James was 38 years old, built like the fence posts he set with his own 2 hands, and known across 3 counties as a man who kept to himself. He ran cattle on a spread called Pine Ridge, 600 acres of hard grass and harder winters, and he ran it alone. There had been a wife once, and a son named Stephen, and a barn that caught fire on a windy October night, while Stephen was 2 miles out, chasing a lost heifer. By the time he rode back over the hill, the barn was a torch against the black sky, and his boy was gone. His wife left within the year. Grief does not always bring 2 people closer. Sometimes it splits them clean down the middle, and that is what it did to Stephen and the woman he had married. She went east to her sisters. He stayed, because the land was the only thing left that still answered to him. For 3 years, he had told himself that a man who owns nothing he can lose is a man who cannot be broken again. It was a lie he had gotten good at believing. Right up until the afternoon, a woman named Jessica Applegate came stumbling out of the Badlands with a dead man's secrets locked inside a cedar box, and a baby girl, not yet born, who would need him more than anyone had needed him in a long, long time. Stephen woke before the sun most mornings, not because the ranch demanded it, though it did, but because sleep had stopped feeling like rest a long time ago. He would light the stove, feed the 2 dogs that had outlived his marriage, and walk the fence line, while the sky turned from black to gray to the pale gold that meant another day of heat was coming. He talked to the cattle more than he talked to people. That was a fact he was aware of and had made his peace with. Trips into the town of Ashford Creek, the nearest settlement with a proper mercantile and a proper church, happened once a month if he could help it, and never longer than it took to buy what he needed and leave before anyone asked him to sit down for coffee. Ashford Creek had grown some in the last decade, mostly on account of the railroad spur that came through 8 miles east, and on account of a man named Raoul Gilligan, who had bought up half the surrounding grazing land through the county land office and now controlled who got water rights and who did not. Stephen had no quarrel with Gilligan. He paid his own water dues on time and kept his fences mended, and a man who does that rarely has business with a land baron. That morning, the 3rd of July, Stephen rode out toward the southern boundary of his property to check on a section of fence the wind had been working loose for a week. The Badlands stretched beyond that fence, like something out of a preacher's warning. Jagged clay buttes striped red and gray, gullies deep enough to swallow a wagon whole, not a tree in sight for 6 miles. Nobody crossed the Badlands on foot in July, nobody with sense. His nearest neighbor, a widow named Ruth Caldwell who ran 40 head of sheep on the section adjoining his, had told him once that solitude suited him the way a good coat suits a man in winter. Useful, warm, but not something a person ought to wear clean through summer as well. Ruth was the only person in the county Stephen let close enough to speak plainly to him, mostly because she had buried a husband of her own, and understood better than most that grief did not keep a calendar. She had stopped by twice that spring, with preserves and unsolicited opinions about how a man ought to let himself live again, and both times Stephen had thanked her for the preserves and ignored the opinions. It was, he privately admitted, a fair trade. He was thinking of nothing in particular, only the wire and the heat and the long list of chores waiting on him back at the house, when his horse, a steady gelding named Whistler, who had never spooked at anything in 4 years, threw his head up and stamped hard. Stephen followed the animal's line of sight out past the fence, past the first ridge of broken clay, and saw something moving. At first, he took it for a stray calf, low to the ground and struggling. Then the shape rose, and he understood he was looking at a woman, and that she was pulling something behind her with both hands, and that even from this distance, he could see the swell of her belly, beneath a dress gone the color of the dirt. Stephen sat still on his horse for the length of one long breath. He had built a fence around more than just his land these last 3 years. He had built one around the part of himself that used to reach for people without thinking twice about the cost. Then he swung down from the saddle and started walking. Up close, she was worse off than the distance had let on. Her hands were raw and bleeding where rope had cut into them. Her lips were cracked. Sweat had cut clean tracks through the dust on her face, and her eyes, when they found him, were the eyes of a woman deciding in half a second whether he was a threat or a chance. "That's far enough," she said, and did not let go of the rope. "You've been dragging that wagon a long way," Stephen said. He kept his hands visible and his voice low, the same tone he used gentling a spooked horse. Wheels broke clean off the axle. "You won't get it another mile like this. I'll manage." "You won't." He nodded toward the sky, where the sun sat directly overhead, with nothing between it and the ground for miles. "Not in this heat. Not carrying what you're carrying." Her hand went instinctively to the curve of her belly, a small motion, and something in her face cracked just slightly, the pride giving half an inch to the exhaustion underneath it. Stephen had seen that look before, on cattle worked past their limit, and on his own reflection, more mornings than he cared to count. "My name is Jessica Applegate," she said finally, like the name itself was a kind of armor she was choosing to set down. "I have nowhere I'm asking you to take me. I only need help getting this wagon somewhere with shade and water, and then I'll trouble you no further. Stephen James." He crouched by the broken axle, ran his hand along the splintered wood, and felt something that was not the ordinary wear of a long road. The brake was too clean at the edges, like it had been worked at with a blade before it finally gave. He did not say this out loud yet. This didn't snap on its own. "I know," she said quietly. "That's rather the problem I'm running from." He looked up at her, and for the first time since the fire, felt the old instinct move in him, the one that used to make him step toward trouble instead of away from it. He told himself it was only decency, a man helping a stranger in need, nothing more. He did not fully believe himself, even then. "There's a cedar box in your wagon bed you keep looking back at like it's worth more than the wagon," Stephen said. "I won't ask what's in it, but if men are chasing you on account of it, you'd best come to my ranch, not sit out here waiting on them to catch up." Jessica studied him a long moment, weighing a stranger's offer against a widow's caution. Then she nodded once, sharp and final, the way a person nods when they've run out of better options. "How far have you come?" Stephen asked, already working the broken axle loose from the wagon frame. "Since the wagon gave out, near 4 miles. Since I left what was left of my home, closer to 30. She said this plainly, without asking for pity, though the toll of it showed in every line of her. "I've had water only since yesterday morning, from a seep I found in a dry creek bed. I was rationing it for the baby more than for myself." Stephen stopped what he was doing and looked at her properly for the first time, past the dirt and the exhaustion, and saw a woman who had made hard calculations about her own survival and come out the other side still standing. "You should have collapsed 4 miles back." "I nearly did, twice." A ghost of dry humor crossed her face, despite everything. "Stubbornness has kept better women than me alive, Mr. James. I expect it'll keep me a while longer yet." He offered her his canteen and watched her drink slow and careful, rationing even now out of long habit. And something in that small, disciplined act told him more about her character than an hour of conversation might have. He filled it again from the skin tied to his saddle and made her drink a second time before he'd let her argue. "There's rope burn on both your palms," he said, examining her hands with more gentleness than his rough, weathered fingers usually managed. "That'll need tending before it festers. It'll keep until wherever we're going. We're going to my ranch, 6 miles north. There's shade, there's water that doesn't need rationing, and there's a roof that doesn't care what kind of trouble follows you home." He met her eyes when he said it, plain and without flourish, the way he said most things. "Unless you've got a better offer waiting somewhere I don't know about." She didn't. They both understood that. Jessica studied him a long moment, weighing a stranger's offer against a widow's caution, the way a person weighs a decision they know may be the only real choice they have left. Then she nodded once, sharp and final. Stephen hitched the broken wagon to his own gelding, lifted the cedar box himself despite her protest that she could carry her own belongings, and helped her up onto Whistler's back, with a gentleness that surprised them both. They started north toward Pine Ridge as the sun climbed higher, and neither of them spoke of what waited behind them in the Badlands, though both of them were listening for it. Pine Ridge sat in a shallow bowl of land, with a spring-fed creek running along its western edge, the kind of property a man builds when he intends to stay somewhere his whole life. The house was modest, 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, but sound, and the barn beside it, rebuilt after the fire, stood square and solid against the sky. Jessica took it all in from the saddle, with the careful eye of a woman used to reading a place for danger before she trusted it for comfort. "You live here alone," she said. It was not quite a question. "I do." Stephen helped her down, mindful of her balance, and did not offer further explanation. Explanations led to questions, and questions led to the barn, and the barn led to Stephen, and that was a door he did not open for strangers. Jessica, for her part, did not push. She had her own doors kept shut, but she also was not a woman inclined toward gratitude that looked like weakness, and the moment her boots touched solid ground, she squared her shoulders and said, "I won't be a burden here. I can cook, I can mend, and I've kept a household ledger since I was 16 years old. Whatever I eat, I intend to earn." Nobody said otherwise. "Your face said it before you climbed off that horse the first time. You were deciding whether helping me was going to cost you something you weren't willing to spend." Stephen actually laughed at that, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch in his own throat, like it had gone rusty from disuse. "You read men quick." "I've had to." Something flickered behind her eyes, gone before he could name it. "My husband taught me that a person who waits to be told the truth usually waits too long to do anything useful with it." He carried the cedar box into the house himself and set it near the hearth without opening it, though his curiosity about it had only grown. Jessica watched him do this, and something in her posture loosened, just slightly, the way a person's shoulders drop when they realize, for the first time in a long while, that they are not the only one keeping watch. That evening he gave her the sleeping loft and told her he'd bunk in the barn, an arrangement she argued against on grounds of propriety, until he pointed out, not unkindly, that a 7 months pregnant woman climbing a loft ladder every night was a poorer arrangement than any question of manners. "Fine," she said, "but I'm cooking. I won't lie under a man's roof and eat his food without earning my keep." "Didn't say you had to lie about anything. You know what I mean, Mr. James." "Stephen." "Jessica, then." And for just a moment, standing in the low gold light of a Dakota evening, with a stranger's roof over her head and a dead man's secrets in a box by the hearth, Jessica Applegate allowed herself something she had not permitted in longer than she could remember. She allowed herself to feel, for one single evening, almost safe. Supper was simple. Beans and salt pork and biscuits Jessica made from memory rather than any recipe. And it was, Stephen admitted around his third helping, the best meal he'd eaten inside his own house in 3 years. "You cook like this, and you were dragging a wagon through the Badlands alone," he said. "Tell me how that adds up." Jessica set down her fork. Outside, the last light was going purple over the western ridge, and the cedar box sat between them near the hearth, like a third guest at the table. "My husband's name was Lawrence Hickey," she said. "We had a homestead 30 miles east of here, near the rail spur. Good land, water rights that Raoul Gilligan wanted for himself and offered a fair price for, twice, and Lawrence turned him down both times, because the price was fair, but the land wasn't for sale. Not to a man who'd already forced out 4 other families that same year." Stephen went still. He knew Gilligan's name the way most ranchers in the territory knew it, as a man to be polite to and careful around. 6 weeks ago, Jessica continued, Lawrence rode into Ashford Creek to file a complaint with the land office. Said he had proof Gilligan was forging survey marks to steal acreage off the neighboring claims, one strip at a time, small enough nobody noticed, until it added up to half a county. He never made it home. They found his horse 3 days later, saddle empty, out past the rail spur. Told me it was an accident, a fall. You don't believe that. You have to understand how the land office worked back then, Jessica said, and caught herself, softening the phrase. What I mean is, Lawrence filed our claim proper, under the Homestead Act, same as most families out here. 5 years proving up the land, building a house, working the soil, and the title becomes yours, free and clear. It's meant to give ordinary families a fair shot at owning something outright. Gilligan understood that most homesteaders couldn't afford a lawyer to check a survey line, and he used that. He'd shave a few acres off one claim, add them onto a parcel he controlled, and repeat it until entire sections had shifted hands on paper, without a single family agreeing to sell an inch. That's theft, dressed up as paperwork. It's worse than theft, because paperwork carries the weight of the law behind it, right up until someone proves it's false. That's what Lawrence was trying to do. Prove it. She wrapped both arms around herself, despite the evening warmth. I know it isn't true, Stephen, because he kept his real proof in a place Gilligan's men never thought to look. Her hand rested on the cedar box, and for the first time, Stephen saw the true weight of what she'd dragged through the Badlands. Not furniture, not keepsakes, but a woman's entire reason for staying alive. It's a ledger, in Lawrence's own hand. Names, dates, forged survey marks. Every deed he manipulated to steal land he had no legal claim to. If it reaches a federal court, every title Raoul Gilligan holds in this territory becomes worthless paper. And the wagon axle wasn't an accident either. 3 nights ago, men came onto what was left of my land, asking questions about a box. I ran before they found it, and I ran before I let them find me. She looked at him directly then, unflinching despite everything the day had cost her. I'm not asking you to fight my fight, Stephen James. I'm asking for water, shelter, and enough time to reach Miles City, where I'm told there's a federal marshal who still believes the law means something out here. Stephen looked at the cedar box a long moment, then at the woman across the table from him, 7 months pregnant, and further from safety than she deserved to be. Miles City's 4 days by wagon in this heat, he said. You won't make it. Not like this, not alone. You're staying here until we figure a smarter way. I told you I wouldn't be a burden. You're not a burden, Jessica. You're a problem I've decided is worth having. He said it plainer than he meant to, and saw her cheeks color slightly in the lamplight, and understood, with some alarm, that the rule he'd kept for 3 years had just quietly failed him for the second time in 1 day. The days that followed settled into an unlikely rhythm. Stephen worked the fence lines and the cattle same as always, but he found reasons now to come back to the house before noon instead of after dark, telling himself it was only sense, a man keeping watch over a woman, alone on his property. Jessica, for her part, had the house running with an order it hadn't known in years. She aired the quilts, scrubbed the stove black clean, and found, tucked in a trunk Stephen hadn't opened since the fire, a small wooden horse carved crude and lopsided by a child's hand. She did not ask him about it. She simply set it on the mantel where he'd see it, and said nothing, and that quiet mercy did more to soften him than any question could have. One evening, mending the same tattered dress she'd worn out of the Badlands, she caught the hem on a nail protruding from the porch step and tore a long gash clean up the side. Stephen, seeing her frustration and wanting to be useful, fetched his own sewing kit, the one his late wife had left behind, and offered, with more confidence than skill, to help. What followed was, by Jessica's later account, the clumsiest attempt at needlework she had ever witnessed. Stephen's large, calloused hands, wholly unsuited to a task that required patience, and a light touch, the thread knotting twice, and the needle finding his thumb once, hard enough to make him swear under his breath, and Jessica laugh out loud for the first time since Lawrence died. "Give it here before you ruin the dress worse than the nail did," she said, still laughing, and took the needle from him. Their hands brushed in the exchange, and neither pulled away quite as quickly as good sense would have suggested. "I haven't heard a woman laugh in this house in 3 years," Stephen admitted. Quieter now. "I haven't laughed at all in longer than that," Jessica said. She looked up at him, the humor still warm in her face, but something else moving underneath it now, something careful and searching. "Stephen, what happened here? The wooden horse on your mantel, the barn that looks newer than the house around it." He could have deflected. He had deflected every version of this question for 3 years running. Instead, he told her about Stephen, about the fire, about riding back over that hill and understanding in one terrible instant that he had traded his son's last afternoon for a lost heifer that turned up safe 2 days later on a neighbor's land. Jessica did not offer empty comfort. She simply set the mending aside, took his rough hand in both of hers, and said, "That wasn't your fault, Stephen. A man can't be in 2 places at once, and grief has a cruel way of making us the villain in our own story when we were only ever a person doing our best with what we knew. It was not a cure. Grief does not work that way. But it was the first time in 3 years someone had said those words to him and meant them, and something in Stephen's chest, long since locked against exactly this kind of tenderness, opened just a crack. He kissed her then, gently, asking permission with the slowness of the motion itself, and she met him halfway, and for one long moment, the Badlands and the cedar box and Raoul Gilligan's men did not exist at all. Ruth Caldwell rode over 2 days later with a jar of blackberry preserves and eyebrows that climbed steadily higher the longer she stayed for coffee, watching Jessica move through Stephen's kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who had already made the place her own. "Well," Ruth said, once Jessica had stepped out to check the wash on the line, "I've been telling you for 2 years to let some warmth back into this house, Stephen James, and here you've gone and done it without so much as consulting me on the matter." "It isn't like that, Ruth. It is exactly like that, and I'll thank you not to insult my eyesight by pretending otherwise." She softened, patting his arm with the familiarity of long friendship. "She seems a fine woman, strong, the kind this territory tends to test hardest and break least often. You be careful with her, Stephen, and be careful with yourself too. I don't want to be bringing preserves to a funeral on account of some land baron's temper." "I hear you. See that you do." Ruth gathered her shawl and paused at the door. "For what it's worth, that boy of yours would be glad to see this house have some laughter in it again. Grief doesn't ask us to keep the house empty forever, Stephen. It only asks that we remember." She left before he could answer, which was, he suspected, entirely her intention. That night, once Carolyn's arrival was still weeks away and the chores were done, Stephen and Jessica sat together on the porch step, watching the last color drain out of the western sky, her hand resting easy in his, neither of them in any particular hurry to speak. It was Jessica who broke the silence first. "I wasn't looking for this," she said quietly. "Any of it. I set out from that homestead thinking only of reaching Miles City alive. I wasn't looking for it either. Stephen turned her hand over gently in his, tracing the healing rope burns across her palm with careful fingers. Man plans one kind of life, and the Lord hands him a different one entirely. I've stopped fighting the difference. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let his arms settle around her, and for a good long while, neither of them said anything else at all, because some evenings don't require words so much as they require simply being allowed to last. The peace did not last, because peace rarely does when a man like Raoul Gilligan has men on his payroll whose entire job is to make sure it doesn't. It was Whistler who gave the first warning, 3 nights later, stamping hard in the corral at an hour when nothing should have disturbed him. Stephen was awake and armed before the second stamp finished, moving through the dark toward the barn window with the quiet, economical motion of a man who had spent a lifetime around animals that did not lie about danger. 2 riders sat their horses at the tree line half a mile out, not moving closer, simply watching the house the way a wolf watches a hen house before deciding the fence is too much trouble. Stephen recognized the posture of men scouting a property, not attacking one, gathering information to carry back to whoever had sent them. He did not wake Jessica. He stood at that window until the riders finally turned and rode off east, back toward Ashford Creek, and only then did he let himself breathe easy. In the morning, he told her anyway, because he had learned in one short week that Jessica Applegate was not a woman who thanked you for protecting her from the truth. "Gilligan knows I'm somewhere in this county," she said, calm in the way of someone who has already imagined the worst outcome many times over and made her peace with facing it. "It was only a matter of time. I should move on before I bring that trouble down on your land." "Your land is my land now, far as trouble's concerned," Stephen said. "You think I'm going to hand you a horse and wave you off into the Badlands again, 7 months along, with armed men between here and Miles City. I think you have a ranch to run, and a life you built carefully out of very little, and I have no right asking you to risk it for a fight that isn't yours." "You didn't ask," Stephen said. "I offered. There's a difference, and I'd thank you to let me be the one who decides what's mine to risk." He spent that day and the next fortifying what needed fortifying, mending the corral gate's weak latch, moving a rifle within easy reach of the kitchen door, riding the property line twice instead of once. He did not tell Jessica everything he was thinking, because some of what he was thinking frightened even him, how quickly and how completely he had gone from a man with nothing left to lose to a man standing guard over the 2 things in the world he was most afraid of losing. There was a night that week when Jessica woke to find the loft empty of his usual watchfulness below, and climbed down to find him sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, Lawrence Hickey's ledger open in front of him, though he could make little sense of the surveyor's shorthand crowding its pages. "You don't have to understand every line of it," she said, easing herself into the chair across from him. "I've read it 100 times over. I can walk you through what matters. I want to understand what we're protecting, all of it, not just the shape of the danger, but the reason for it." He turned the ledger toward her. "Your husband knew this could get him killed. Why keep at it?" Jessica was quiet a moment, tracing one finger along a column of her late husband's careful handwriting. "Because 4 families before us lost their land to the same trick and had no proof, only suspicion, nobody in the county would act on without evidence. Lawrence used to say, a wrong left unwritten has a way of repeating itself on the next family down the road. He wasn't trying to be a hero, Stephen. He just couldn't stomach watching it happen again while he had the means to stop it. That's a kind of courage most men don't have. It's the kind that gets a man killed, too." Her voice caught slightly, and Stephen reached across the table to still her hand with his own. "I used to be angry with him for it, for choosing what was right over what was safe, and leaving me and this baby to carry the cost of that choice alone. I'm not angry anymore. I understand it now. Some things are worth more than the safety of keeping quiet." They sat together a while longer in the lamplight, and Stephen found himself understanding, for the first time since the fire, that a person could grieve someone and still choose to keep living fully in spite of it. That the two things were not opposites but companions, and that Jessica had already learned this lesson the hard way, long before she'd ever met him. Supplies ran low toward the end of the second week. Salt, flour, coffee, the ordinary needs of two people that could not simply be willed away by circumstance. And Stephen made the ride into Ashford Creek alone, against Jessica's wishes and his own better instincts, because a man cannot hide from every errand forever. The mercantile business went quickly and without incident. It was in the saloon after, where he'd stopped only to ask after news from Miles City, that Raoul Gilligan found him. Gilligan was not a large man, but he carried himself like one, dressed finer than the territory required, and speaking in the smooth, unhurried way of a man accustomed to people listening, whether they wanted to or not. "Stephen James," Gilligan said, settling uninvited onto the stool beside him. "Pine Ridge. Good grass down there, I hear. Careful land. You keep. A man who minds his own business. That's the general idea, yes. Funny thing about widows in hard times," Gilligan went on, turning his glass slowly on the bar. "They wander. Get themselves lost out past the rail spur, carrying belongings that aren't rightly theirs to carry. If a man happened to be sheltering one, purely out of Christian kindness, I'd hope he'd understand there's no shame in returning lost property to where it came from. No shame, and considerable reward for the trouble." Stephen set his own glass down with deliberate care. "I don't know what property you're referring to, Mr. Gilligan, and I'd be careful how you finish that sentence, on account of I don't take kindly to threats dressed up as neighborly advice." "Wasn't a threat." Gilligan smiled, thin and without warmth. "Only a friendly word between men who both understand how quickly a quiet ranch can stop being quiet, if the wrong sort of attention gets drawn to it." Stephen stood, unhurried, and looked down at the smaller man with the flat, level stare that had once, long before the fire took his son, made grown men reconsider whatever argument they were about to start with him. "Draw whatever attention you like. Gilligan, I've buried a boy and lost a marriage, and rebuilt a life out of ash with my own two hands. There isn't much left standing between me and any trouble your men care to bring, and I promise you, I will meet it standing up." He set coins on the bar for his drink and walked out into the white afternoon light, and did not look back to see Gilligan's face, though he did not need to. He had said what needed saying, and he rode home faster than he'd ridden in, because some instinct older than reason told him the fight was coming sooner than he'd hoped. It came 4 nights later, under a moon thin enough to hide most of what moved beneath it. Stephen woke to Whistler's scream, not a stamp this time, but a full, terrified cry, and he was up and armed and moving before Jessica had even opened her eyes in the loft above. Through the kitchen window he counted 5 riders coming hard across the north pasture, and understood in that instant that Gilligan had stopped asking politely, "Jessica, stay up there, bar the loft, and don't come down for anything short of my voice telling you it's safe." He did not wait to see her comply. He moved into the yard with the rifle Lawrence Hickey's own widow had insisted he keep loaded and near, and he used every advantage his own land gave him: the corral fence for cover, the darkness he knew better than any stranger riding it for the first time, the barn's solid timber walls at his back. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and close. 3 of Gilligan's men dismounted to search the house, while 2 held the yard on horseback, rifles braced against their saddles, confident in the numbers they carried, and not yet accounting for a man defending the only 2 things he had left to lose in the world. Stephen let the first 2 come through the corral gate before he moved, using the dark and the familiar geometry of his own land, the way another man might use a loaded weapon. He put his shoulder into the first man, before the man's eyes had adjusted to the shadow between the timber rails, driving him back hard against the fence post, with enough force to fold him over it. The second brought a rifle stock around in a wide, clumsy arc that Stephen ducked under by instinct built from years of handling spooked livestock in tight spaces, and answered with a short, hard blow that put the man down in the dirt before he'd finished cursing. His knuckles split open on the second man's jaw. He did not notice until later. A third came at him from the barn door with a knife, and it was Jessica, disobeying his order exactly as he should have known she would, who brought a fire poker down across the man's forearm from the kitchen doorway, giving Stephen the half-second he needed to finish what the man had started. It was the fourth man, the one holding a gun on Jessica from 10 feet off, revolver leveled steady at her belly, with a coldness that made Stephen's blood run to ice, who nearly ended everything. "The box," the man said. "Or the widow gets it right here, and we take the box off her cooling body instead." Stephen had his own rifle up and steady, close enough to end it, but not fast enough to guarantee the man's finger didn't twitch first. And for one endless second, the whole night balanced on a single breath. That was the second the yard filled with torchlight and hoofbeats, a full posse of 6 riders coming hard through the gate, led by a broad-shouldered man on a black horse, whose voice cut through the chaos like a bell. "Federal Marshal, lower your weapon, or you're a dead man where you stand." Federal Deputy Marshal Henry Aiden had ridden out of Miles City 11 days earlier, not on a tip about Jessica Applegate at all, but on a federal inquiry into Raoul Gilligan's land dealings that had been building quietly for the better part of a year. Posing as a livestock buyer, Aiden had spent 2 weeks in Ashford Creek, gathering exactly the kind of testimony a courtroom would need, and it was only that same evening, watching Gilligan's men ride out armed and in force, that he understood the final piece had arrived on its own. The gunman holding Jessica at bay lowered his revolver the instant 6 federal rifles came level with his chest, which told Stephen everything he needed to know about the difference between a man paid to threaten a woman and a man willing to die for the privilege. Gilligan himself was arrested 3 days later in his own parlor in Ashford Creek, produced without struggle, the fight having gone out of him the moment word reached him that a federal marshal had personally witnessed his hired men committing armed assault on a homestead. The cedar box, Lawrence Hickey's ledger inside it, went into Marshal Aiden's custody that same night, and within the week, a federal judge in Miles City had reviewed enough forged survey marks and falsified deeds to void every disputed title Gilligan had claimed across 3 counties. "Man built an empire on paper that was never worth the ink," Aiden told Stephen, standing in the yard the next morning while his men loaded Gilligan's associates into a prison wagon. "Takes a brave woman to carry the proof of that 30 miles through open Badlands rather than let it die with her husband." "She's more than brave," Stephen said, and did not elaborate further, though the marshal's knowing look suggested no further elaboration was required. Jessica's labor began that same night, 11 days early, by her own reckoning, but healthy in every way that mattered, and Stephen James, who had once believed himself finished with the terror and wonder of bringing new life into a house, found himself boiling water and holding a laboring woman's hand through the small hours of the morning with a steadiness that surprised them both. Ruth Caldwell arrived within the hour, summoned by a rider Stephen sent the moment labor began. And it was Ruth's steady hands and years of frontier experience that guided Jessica through the long, hard work of it, while Stephen kept water boiling and paced a groove into the kitchen floorboards that would remain, faintly, for years afterward. "First babies take their time," Ruth told him during a brief lull, wiping her hands on her apron. "This one's early, but she's strong, Stephen, same as her mother. Go on and sit with her a spell. Sometimes, what a woman needs most in that room isn't a midwife's hands, but a familiar voice telling her she isn't facing it alone." He went in and sat beside Jessica through the worst of it, her grip on his hand fierce enough to ache, and found that fear for someone else's well-being carried a different weight entirely than fear for his own, heavier in some ways, but somehow easier to carry when there was another person's hand to hold onto while he carried it. Carolyn Thompson Hickey was born just before dawn, named for Jessica's own late mother, healthy and loud and entirely unbothered by the drama that had preceded her arrival by only a handful of days. Stephen held her first, at Jessica's insistence, and stood in the doorway of the house he had rebuilt from ash 3 years earlier, with a stranger's daughter in his arms, and felt something in his chest that he had genuinely believed was gone from him forever. 6 weeks passed. Raoul Gilligan stood trial in Miles City on charges of land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with Lawrence Hickey's death, and was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, his considerable fortune seized to compensate the families whose land he had stolen through forged surveys. Justice, slow as it often is on the frontier, arrived complete and without mercy for a man who had shown none himself. Pine Ridge, meanwhile, healed in ways Stephen had stopped believing were possible. Jessica stayed on, at first because a widow with a newborn daughter and nowhere else to go had few better options, and then, as the weeks wore on, because neither of them could any longer pretend the arrangement was one of convenience alone. It was Henry Aiden, returning through the territory on federal business some months later, who found Stephen on the porch one evening, with Carolyn asleep against his shoulder, and asked, with the dry humor of a lawman who had seen plenty of frontier romances bloom out of far less promising circumstances, whether Stephen intended to make the arrangement permanent or simply let the whole county keep guessing. Stephen proposed to Jessica that same week, on the exact spot along the southern fence line where he had first seen her dragging a broken wagon through the heat, on the theory, he told her, that some places deserve a better memory than the one they started with. Jessica said yes before he'd finished the question, laughing through unexpected tears, and Carolyn, propped against her mother's hip, gurgled her own approval loud enough to make them both laugh harder. They were married that autumn, in Ashford Creek's small church, the same building where 6 years earlier, a very different, very lonely version of Stephen James had buried his son. He stood at that altar now with a new wife beside him and her daughter, soon to be his in every way that mattered beyond blood, held by a neighbor woman in the front pew, and understood at last that grief and love had never actually been enemies. They were only ever two visitors to the same house, and a man strong enough could learn to let them both stay. Before we move into the ending of tonight's story, I want to say a genuine thank you for staying with us this far. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? If this story moved you even a little, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We are working to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single person reading this is helping make that happen. It costs nothing, and it means everything, to a small channel trying to grow one honest story at a time. Thank you for your support. Now, let's finish this one together. The Dakota sun sets slow in late autumn, gold light stretching long and easy across 600 acres of grass that had, 3 years earlier, belonged to a man who believed he had nothing left worth protecting. On the porch of a house rebuilt twice now, once from fire and once from fear, Stephen James sits beside his wife with their daughter drowsing between them and watches the same ridge where he once saw a stranger fighting alone against a world that had already taken everything from her. There is a lesson in a story like this one, plain enough that it does not need much dressing up. Grief convinces a person that the safest life is an empty one, that a heart kept closed cannot be broken again. But a locked door does not keep sorrow out nearly so well as it keeps love out, and the two of them, Stephen and Jessica, found out the hard way that the only real protection against loss is choosing, again and again, to let somebody in anyway. Thank you for walking through the Badlands with us tonight. If Stephen and Jessica's story stayed with you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who still believes love finds its way home, no matter how far out into the wilderness it has to travel first. Until the next story, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. The end.